well. James, this is a photo that's identified during his second military service. So he served in both the Mexican-American War and then later in the Civil War. He was actually quite instrumental in organizing early volunteers in New Mexico for the Civil War in 1861 as a captain. And his big battle, if you will, was the Battle of Valverde, if you know anything about that, that took place down by Bosque del Apache. And they were actually defending Fort Craig. And there's a lot written about that battle. Technically it was a Confederate win, although the Confederates lost a lot of their mules and horses, and their campaign to then later take Santa Fe and move on to California never really came to fruition. But they did, it was considered a Union loss, and actually the general at Fort Craig, Canby was his name, kind of pinned a lot of the blame on a lot of the Hispanic Hispanic enlisted men, and actually James took a real offense to that and spent a lot of time defending both their patriotism and their fighting. And actually the fort wasn't taken, so it wasn't a real Confederate success, and it is considered one of the more, if not one of the most significant battles in the West, in the American West. James served in the Civil War for a year and then later asked to be discharged. At that point he had 6 children and his wife down in Pajarito in the South Valley at his home, the Gutierrez-Hubbell House, it's called now. And so he went back went back home and became a very prosperous trader. They were trading Isleta Boulevard, which is the road, which is really not much now, that goes right by the Gutierrez-Hubbell House, was the El Camino Real. So that was really your connection, New Mexico's connection to the outside world. And he used that, his home, and then later the trading post that they built, which was attached to the home, as the base of their operations for trading along the El Camino Real, and then out to California, out to St. Louis, down to Mexico. That whole history of the traders, he in some cases had trains of oxen, over 200 oxen, really extraordinary. They were out in remote, isolated parts of the West. They had to really bring their own security. They had to bring their own food. They were dealing with heat and cold, and so that's really, he would be gone for months on end. And actually Juliana would really, as a woman, she was still kind of expected, and it was assumed that she played a big role in the family business and overseeing the trading post, of course, as well as the family. They had 8 children that grew up there. One of their children, whose people might know, actually all of their children were at the time later as adults, were very prominent and well known. Their most well known child was Lorenzo Hubbell, who opened the Hubbell, what is now the Hubbell Trading Post, historic site in Ganado, Arizona. So he followed in his father's footsteps and opened up actually a series of trading posts in Arizona, trading with the Navajos. The children actually were also very fascinating. This is a family photo. This is James Hubbell here. This is his wife Juliana when she was quite young, and most of the children here are their children. There's also some of Juliana's, her sister and her brother, who she was very close to, as well as her parents. This, incidentally, is Lorenzo Hubbell, later of Hubbell Trading Post fame. This, incidentally, is Luisa, their daughter, who is also buried here, and several of her children. The children, it was quite fascinating. They get married in 1849, and which is at the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is the treaty with Mexico. And so it really marked the new American period of New Mexico. And it's often said that Juliana, her parents, who are featured here, were very prominent, both her generations earlier under Spanish control, and then later under Mexican authority. Her grandfather actually was one of the first Mexican governors of New Mexico when Mexico achieved its independence in 1824. So her family was very prominent, and it was actually an arranged marriage. James was actually a sheriff in Valencia County. Valencia was much larger and a very significant area at the time, so he had some political influence he was in his mid-20s, and so it was an arranged marriage with Juliana, who was 16 at the time. And it's often said that her family was very politically astute and could see the changing political winds and wanted to remain at their status and their place, their family place in New Mexico would be maintained. Maybe I'll stop there. I'd love to take some questions. And do folks have any questions or anything?
That's interesting that you said it's an arranged marriage, because I thought he had fallen in love with her, but maybe not so much.
Well, by all accounts, it was a very, the family was very, very close. The children, Juliana gave birth to 12 children. Fortunately, 4 of them died before the age of 3, which was not all that uncommon to lose young children at the time. But they all grew up in the house, and actually, and then there was another generation. One of the sons, Felipe, would later inherit the house, and his children grew up there. That was the last generation to grow up in what is now the Gutierrez-Hubbell House. But by all accounts, it was a very close family, and James, was he did definitely fall in love with New Mexico, and then I think it's fair to say he did fall in love with Juliana. Very integrated with her family, would go into business with one of her brothers, and by all accounts spoke perfect Spanish. The children are interesting too. Later, James would bring his parents from Connecticut to live with them in Pajarito in the South Valley. So the children really, of course, had the strong Hispanic upbringing and was very connected to that culture, but then very much were comfortable in the new American culture with James and his parents there. And so it's often said that the children were very comfortable being either referred to as Carlos or Charles, and moving back and forth between English and Spanish. And again, it sort of harkened this new American period. They were comfortable in both worlds, and that's often attributed to their success. Particularly Lorenzo, again, who would later open the Hubbell Trading Post and trade with the Navajo. He was seen as very respectful to the Navajo and their culture, and very interested in learning about their culture and learning about their language. And so both Lorenzo and several of the other sons that worked with Lorenzo in Arizona learned Dene, learned some of the Navajo language, and it's, by all accounts, he treated them very fairly. A lot of the traders, there is a lot of stories of taking advantage of native people that they were trading with, but by all accounts, Lorenzo and I would argue his father, James, by all accounts, treated Native Americans that they traded with very fairly. So. And
we should note, Juliana is not buried here.
She is not. So here we have Santiago, or James Hubbell, obviously, and then several of his daughter, Luisa's first daughter, who actually, this is Luisa here. Did I point her out? She was actually seen as very beautiful and very educated for the time as a woman. Is buried here, and then she married Dr. Thomas, and so that's this. This is the Thomas side, including one of her children. Juliana, James's wife, devoted wife, she dies in 1899, and she's buried in Pajarito at the cemetery. She was a devout Catholic, and the family was Catholic, very, very devout. So she's buried and at that time you had to be active with the church to be buried there. So she's there, and she's kind of all alone, actually. A lot of the other children are buried in various other Calvary cemeteries, another one where a number of the children are buried. So it's James, by all accounts, James, his children again embraced Catholicism, but he was Protestant, and it does appear, in addition to him being away for months and months and not participating in the church, he didn't really take to Catholicism, but he did, So he was buried here in 1885. He dies in 1885, and actually the Fairview Cemetery was still relatively new as a cemetery. Yes.
Was his mother Mexican?
So there is a Wikipedia article flying around that his mother was Spanish or something, and that is incorrect. His family were settled in Connecticut in the actually maybe even in the late 1600s. So they had been there for quite some time, and they were.
He was a
white.
Connecticut Yankee.
He was a Connecticut Yankee, yeah, mostly of English and Danish background. And Juliana's family, of course, were also some of the first whites that settled in Pajarito in the 1600s. So again, very prominent family that settled there, and actually there's still a lot of descendants in that area in the South Valley that are related to Juliana, her family. Any other questions?
So it's not called Pajarito anymore?
No, that's the neighborhood. It's still kind of considered as a neighborhood. Pajarito is the neighborhood, and it's near Los Padillas. If you know, that's another area. There's Los Padillas School, and there's Pajarito School as well. So as a neighborhood, it's referred to, but it's not a village anymore. Those were villages, and they were a stop along the El Camino Real. So maybe I'll say a little bit about the house. The house that stands today is really the home of the family, and they were. There's a section that was then later added in the late 1860s, which is where the trading post was. So they kind of separated the commercial part of the business from the family home. The trading post, unfortunately, was kind of just left, and it just sort of disintegrated. By the early 1970s, there was a couple of little remnants of walls that they knocked down, but it doesn't exist anymore. But it was a very important trading post. There's accounts of James going to St. Louis in the 1870s and 60s and 70s, and spending a month buying supplies for the store. The New Mexico really. The railroads did not start to really penetrate and change, trading until certainly by 1880 is really when it's seen as the last of the caravans. You weren't going to take 200 oxen to St. Louis or out to California anymore, obviously, because of the trains had definitely penetrated by that point. But that. He would go out. He would trade. He'd bring goods, fine goods, back to his trading shop in Pajarito. He'd go out to California. Again, that's really, he was seen as a very strong and hardy man. I mean, you had to be for that kind of work. He dies in 1885, and by that point, again, the whole trading part of the family business is done. His son, who inherits the house, Felipe, who was kind of a big deal in New Mexico at the time, was actually seen as a very prominent farmer. Felipe imports a lot of different orchards, a lot of different apples, which were kind of new for New Mexico. This is in the 1880s, 90s, and becomes a real farmer and operates the store more as a local store. But that part of the business, the trading business, was really done by that point. Again, because of the railroads. The store operates. Felipe dies in 1910, and then his wife runs the store, and it was also a post office until 1929. By all accounts, the store was not really very successful, and when she dies, they close it, and that's it for the store and for the family business there. Any other questions?
How old were they both when they died?
So there's some debate about when James was born. Here it puts his birth at 1824. He was, 1824 to 1885? What's that? I didn't know math. I'm not the...
61?
61, yeah. He died kind of young. Juliana dies in 1899, and she was older. When was she born? she was at least approaching 70. Again, she had she had 12 children. She was running, really overseeing operations. She's a really interesting woman as well. As I mentioned, she's got really a fascinating history, and was seen as someone who was very prominent in the community and looked out. The family obviously is very wealthy. If you go to the Gutierrez-Hubbell House, you'll see these high ceilings, this long central hallway. No one lived like that in the 1850s when they built that house. And so they were putting their wealth, their prominence on display just in the house itself. But she was seen as someone who, in later years in particular, people would come to talk to her, tell her about different families that were struggling. Her family hired a lot of people too, so there was a certain responsibility or obligation, but she was known for looking out for those that were less fortunate in the community. There's actually accounts of her giving the smallpox vaccine in the 1890s when that was ravishing a lot of small communities. And so she was really known for helping out. And there was a kind of expectation for a family like this that they would look out for others. Their parlor, one of the big rooms in the house, was seen as almost like a community room where they would have a lot of funerals of prominent people in the community, as well as celebrations, weddings, and that sort of thing. So again, kind of with wealth came certain responsibility that she really recognized and honored. Any other questions? The house is a very good example of territorial style, architectural style, adobe. It's an authentic adobe home, which is actually considered one of the best examples of territorial style homes in New Mexico. So if you're an architectural person, it's really fascinating. It's over 2 feet thick walls, so filled with adobe, and then there's mud plaster on the outside. It's pretty extraordinary that the house survived all these years. There was a number of years of neglect. Maybe just a little piece of history I'll say that we tend to not talk a lot about, but the house was saved. The house was saved in 2000 from development. The last grandchild who owned the house, Louise was her name, she died in 1996, and her husband sells the house to a developer in 1997. At that time the property was 10 acres, now it's 16 acres. But the developer wanted to develop, and he had plans to build like 1 acre housing units. And people in the South Valley in particular, but in the community, in Albuquerque more generally, organized, they got active, and they put pressure on Bernalillo County. And I work for Bernalillo County. I should probably be careful about what I say, but I don't think they really wanted to buy the house, but they put enough pressure that the county, which wasn't really in the business of maintaining historic houses, buys this property, which needs a tremendous amount of work. And then after they buy it, there was over 7 years of extensive restoration of the home. So that home requires a lot of TLC, a lot of time and effort to maintain it, but I give the county a lot of credit for stepping in, and I of course salute those that organized and wanted this piece of very important New Mexican history to be saved and preserved. So again, if final thoughts or final plug, check out the house and try to see the very important home and some of the fascinating history.
What's the website for the house?
If you Google Gutierrez-Hubbell House, you'll either come to the Bernalillo County website or the Friends group, which is good that I want to give them a plug as well. The Gutierrez-Hubbell House Alliance, which is a nonprofit Friends group that do a lot of organizing and fundraising and support the house, and made up of all volunteer labor. And so they have good information on our site as well. The site is open to the public Thursday through Saturday, 10 to 4 o'clock, where you can see the house and try to get on our. If you join our newsletter, you'll learn about our different events.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Yay.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.